The contemporary opinion of an effective martial artist is somebody training in multiple disciplines that cover stand-up, wrestling and grappling, and the most common ones taught to facilitate this are Muay Thai, wrestling and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And while I'm not disputing the fact that this approach does produce a competent martial artist, I think it runs into its own kind of limitations. So I propose that we expand on this now and actually look to disciplines outside of what are just considered to be practical martial arts styles in order to further build on those skills that we've got in ways that you wouldn't be able to attain otherwise. Now, there's always been a big debate among martial artists, especially in the modern era, about which style is the most effective or practical in combat. And in the past, what you did is pretty much picked a discipline and just stuck with that throughout your training journey. Bruce Lee is said to have been one of the first people to actually challenge this model and adopt a cross-training approach. And at that time, Bruce received a lot of flack for his criticism of traditional styles, but I think people became defensive and essentially threw the baby out with the bathwater without truly understanding what he was saying, and took it to mean that he meant everything about that style was useless, without nuance, and missed the deeper relevance of the philosophy. What he was really highlighting was a problem with the mentality of certain styles and their rigid adherence to the way things had always been done, which disregarded any other opinions, and he quite rightly believed this imposed limitations on what they were able to do. So Bruce's philosophy that eventually became JKD basically entailed that you'd investigate and train in different styles, then adopt useful elements of them into your own unique blend. And this is what he meant by using no way as way, and way meaning a concrete and rigid style that one adheres to. And this is something that's now quite commonplace due to the emergence of MMA into the mainstream, but in the 60s and 70s when Bruce lived, this was quite a revolutionary thing to do and was considered a rebellious act. And in my experience, something very similar is actually happening to this today, in which many contemporary martial artists are very quick to dismiss entire disciplines and training methods, considering them to be too unpractical and flashy, and that's because they're focused too much on surface level things. And so it's not what you see on the surface, which would be those techniques and how they directly apply, but rather the benefits garnered by learning those skills that will have a direct impact on other traits such as body awareness, footwork and balance, rhythm and timing, flexibility, range of motion, the list goes on. But if you're only viewing things in one-dimensional terms, then you're never going to understand that. So when we have this close-minded view, in a weird way, it's kind of like saying performing burpees has no utility because you can't use it in a fight, which obviously sounds ridiculous because we're all well aware of how conditioning exercises work. But really, this is how many practitioners today view some more flamboyant styles like wushu or capoeira. And I think we should now evolve this outside of martial arts entirely and begin to look at how training in other disciplines can directly impact our martial arts. We have seen some of this nowadays with forward-thinking trainers having their athletes working upon things like gymnastic skills. And we also saw it a bit when McGregor introduced movement training with Ido Portal that wasn't a martial arts style, but despite those examples, it certainly isn't something that's been widely adopted, and in many cases I believe we've actually regressed. Collectively, we're still thinking very much inside the box, and while cross-training is a philosophy that is now widely adopted, it's still very much limited to martial arts styles that are considered practical, like Muay Thai and boxing. There's multiple reasons for this, and I certainly understand one of the major ones is that martial arts has so many different elements to it that some selection and bias has to be made, otherwise you'd never see progression. But when you've got a decent foundation in place, it will only be a net positive for you to begin to explore some of these other disciplines. And I was pleased to learn that Lomachenko's father had him train in traditional Ukrainian dancing called hopak for years, and it also comes as no surprise that Lomachenko is considered to have some of the best footwork in boxing. So I found an interesting article about this, and I'd like to read a couple of quotes from it. Ever since Vasily could walk, his father focused on his son's boxing footwork, his steps and positioning and fundamentals, feet always before fists. He told Vasily the dance classes would tie all of their work together. I didn't understand it at the time, Vasily says. He didn't pay attention to my hands, he didn't pay attention to my defense. First, he was paying attention to my footwork. He recognizes what might not be obvious to casual observers who see the knockouts. All the power, all the coordination, all my victories, everything comes out of my footwork, Lomachenko says. And I really like that quote and think it's quite apt to the situation we're discussing in this video, and how he says about the casual observers who are not able to understand on first glance how all the power is generated. And that's very similar to how some of these modern martial artists will disregard these styles as flashy, just not understanding what they might be able to gain by working in some of them, and how that could translate and benefit their martial arts skills. We've also seen this with people like Prince Nazim Hamed, who was known as the Dancing Prince, and he was a very polarising figure during his popularity, and many people considered him to be a bit of a clown because he was very unconventional, but nevertheless he had a record of 31-1 and only retired due to problems with his hands. Jean-Claude Van Damme had a history of studying ballet, which is very evident in his graceful kicking techniques, and even Bruce Lee, who we mentioned earlier, was a cha-cha dancing champion in Hong Kong before he was well known. What's obvious to me is that people who've trained in these, what we could call secondary disciplines, always have something a little bit extra about them, whether it's the intricate footwork and incredible balance like Lomachenko, or a graceful fluidity combined with a ferocious intensity like Bruce Lee. And that's just with the example of dance. You know, know, my own training background I'd consider to be quite eclectic, and I can definitely draw parallels between all of the different things I've done and how they've contributed to my own unique style. Things like the patterns that we learned in Taekwondo that many people consider pointless taught me things like relaxation, snap and control that directly impacted my boxing. I was also heavily into tricking for a while, which is a dynamic and acrobatic form of martial arts, and I can't even begin to express how much that's helped me in other areas, but especially with things like balance and agility, as well as exploding from a static position into a powerful and dynamic movement. The knee-jerk reaction and huge misconception that people take when you suggest working with some of these other styles is they take it to mean you're suggesting you're going to perform a flash kick and knock somebody out, which is just not what you're suggesting at all. And it's understandable, because if you're a complete beginner and you wish to go into something like MMA, then you need to be proficient in all the skills. In the past, you'd have had to go to individual experts in those fields to learn, but nowadays many modern schools will provide MMA all under one roof, and the good schools will still follow the model of bringing in a specialist to teach each of the disciplines. But unfortunately, a lot of schools don't do this, and it's one instructor teaching a little bit of everything. If you stick with one style, then you will learn a base skill set, but the consequence of that is it's going to be very generic, and I just can't understand why people would want to cap their progression like that. And this is evident today with many martial artists, even very experienced ones, and yeah, they might have nice tight punches and stuff, but they're often quite stiff and lack individuality and finesse in their movements, and they all end up kind of looking the same. In my own experience, really high-level martial artists who've got a lot of training experience are always really open to this idea, but it's the ones that are very identified with a rigid style and way of doing things that seem to take issue with it. Those that claim that there's no virtue in learning flashy techniques mirrors the sentiment of the 1960s in Bruce Lee's day, when people didn't like his suggestions to transcend one style. And I've personally got a really disappointing example of this, because there was this young kid that I was doing some private training sessions with, and his dad wanted me to work upon some dynamic kicking techniques with him. And one of the reasons for that was because his regular striking coach had really chastised him during a sparring session because he threw a spinning back kick and said something along the lines of, "Those techniques are banned in my gym and you're not allowed to do them and you shouldn't be training in them." So the sad but quite funny part about that is his dad ended up kind of going behind that coach's back and hiring me in secret to work on these techniques with his son. So what I'm basically preaching in this video is open-mindedness, and be willing to try out different things, because there's always more to know, and when you do that, it opens up so many more avenues that weren't apparent to you before. What it comes down to is individual choices and shaping your own unique style in the way you'd like to cultivate it. So it's like, if you desire to have the footwork of a dancer, then you need to know it's highly unlikely that you're going to be able to develop that just doing a simple martial arts style, and for that you're going to have to go elsewhere. Thank you very much for watching this video today, guys. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you're not already, and if you've got any questions, just pop them down below. I do my best to try to answer everyone's questions if I've got time to do that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.